Hello everyone. Today, as part of the Conference on Wisdom, I'd like to talk with you a bit about the figure of Socrates as an excellent paradigm for wisdom seeking. Socrates was the quintessential philosopher, and for those of you who don't know, philosophy, classically understood and at its origins, is literally the love of wisdom. The word philosophy was coined by the ancient shaman philosopher Pythagoras, who chose it over the more typical term in use at the time, sophos, which meant wise man. Why? Well, in his view, quote, only the God is wise. Wisdom is the sole possession, or rather the exclusive quality, of the divine. Human beings can at best love or desire wisdom. They cannot make themselves be wise without, at the same time, somehow transcending or dying to their mortal nature, letting all things drop, all passing, finite, imperfect things, leaving all their private and egoic concerns behind, and in doing so, becoming in some way divine. This is why Plato has Socrates refer to philosophizing, or loving wisdom, as, quote, the art of dying. It's also why Aristotle refers to philosophy as our mode of, quote, immortalizing. Philosophy, or that love of wisdom, whereby we die to our mortal selves and come into divinity, is therefore deeply related to our highest happiness. So understand that Socrates was a philosopher in this ancient sense of that much maligned and misunderstood word. For those of you who don't know his story, Socrates was taken to court by a few of his fellow citizens who drew up a writ of impiety against him. He was accused of 2 crimes, namely, of not believing in the gods of his native city, and introducing new gods, on the one hand, and of corrupting the youth, on the other. Socrates gave a famous defense speech before the Athenian assembly. The best account we have of this speech is found in a dialogue by Plato called the Apology. Socrates was unsuccessful in his defense. He was found guilty and executed by drinking hemlock. The charge against Socrates, this writ of impiety, was an extraordinary crime, folks. And you need to understand that Athens wasn't a place with very many limits on free speech. In fact, free speech, or the ability to tell the truth, no matter what that truth was, something they called parrhesia, was held up by the Athenians generally as a great and noble good, as something that especially distinguished Hellenic peoples from their barbarian counterparts, in fact. Ancient Athens wasn't like medieval Europe under the Church, where heretics would be burned at the stake with regularity. Nor was it a place where scientists like Galileo later in the 16th and 17th centuries would be muzzled or placed under house arrest. And it wasn't like today either, where a person might say or post something on social media or online and then be mobbed and destroyed by anonymous aggressors in order to satiate their trumped-up puritanical offense-taking. Nope. In ancient Athens, you could pretty much say whatever you wanted about the gods, about your neighbors, or about anything, really. There were, of course, laws and law courts in which you could be held accountable for slander. But during the special times allotted for their great, tragic, and comic festivals, which were generously scattered throughout the entire year, Greek peoples could get away with saying just about anything concerning anyone, no matter what it was. In fact, all such acts of parrhesia were sanctioned as part of one's pious participation in the Dionysian festivals. Now, this isn't to say that there were no ways to offend, or to cause an offense, or that everything was considered pious or hunky-dory. clearly that wasn't the case. Just ask Socrates. Indeed, a charge of impiety was a very serious matter in Athens. It was worse than murder, really, because whereas murder might only affect a single person, or a single person's family or household, impiety was a kind of pollution that was thought to bleed out in such a way as to affect the whole city's welfare and safety. Still, a charge of impiety was normally restricted to a blasphemy like profaning the mysteries, mutilating sacred objects like the herms, or sacrilegious acts to do with the city. But Socrates didn't do any of these things. Apart from pretty specific, reckless things one might do, it was hard to come under the gun of a charge of impiety. People in Athens weren't held to account for having unorthodox opinions or for speaking against a creed or a dogma. Really, such things as creeds and dogmas or doctrines didn't even exist back then. Religion per se didn't exist in Athens, or at least in the way that we think about what religion is. Sure, there were cults to various gods and goddesses, and you could observe rituals or make prayers to whatever gods you pleased, but impiety wasn't ever something that had to do with something somebody might say. It was always more or less about something that somebody did. So if it wasn't so much what Socrates said, then what did he do that drove people nuts? Well, Socrates tells us in his defense speech. He says that, while not being himself a sophist or wise man, and certainly not being a man who would therefore deign to sell his so-called wisdom to others or to teach them any sort of knowledge he himself didn't possess, he had acquired a name for a certain kind of wisdom, which he admits that he probably does in fact have. However, this wisdom of which he speaks isn't any great thing. Socrates calls it a human wisdom, or anthropina sophia. He says that the people who speak against him and who are most angry with him feel that they have a much greater wisdom than this anthropina sophia. Furthermore, some of them suggest that Socrates himself is being disingenuous about his wisdom, that he is indeed wise in the sense of being clever, but that he's also ironic in his speech, whereby he attempts to hide or to dissemble from this fact. Socrates, however, denies having any such wisdom. So what is this anthropina sophia, this human wisdom that Socrates agrees he possesses? In his defense speech, he tells us the story of how Chaerephon, a well-known Athenian citizen and a companion to Socrates, once visited the oracle at Delphi. For those of you who have never heard of the oracle or Delphi before, in ancient times, the city of Delphi was considered the belly button or omphalos of the world. It was Middle Earth, the very center of the cosmic universe. As such, it was a place of great spiritual significance, for it was where the realms of the heavens, earth, and the underworld all had intimate connection, and it was the place where the oracle resided. The oracle was a kind of ancient institution of prophecy and spiritual power, a place dedicated to Apollo, but also associated with Dionysus. Perhaps you've heard how when travelers in ancient times approached Delphi, and as they passed through the gates of its main temple, they would walk below the famous inscription over its entrance, bidding each of them to know thyself, or gnothi se auton. This divine command to know thyself is also at the heart of Socrates' philosophic inquiries. At any rate, the priestess of Apollo sat in the temple at Delphi, and having fallen into a state of trance, like this trance state, right, she'd be overtaken by certain ecstasies in which she might offer a riddled response to sojourners from far and wide who were desperate to know the answers to their pressing questions about the ambitions they harbored, perhaps the outcomes of wars, political machinations, and so forth. These oracular responses are famously vague or cryptic. Often visitors were emissaries sent by kings and conquerors, and having been relayed the message, these great men would be inflamed with desires, their pride or hubris, and most especially their pretense to knowing what the oracle really meant would get the better of them, which in turn would lead to their own downfall. Chaerephon didn't visit Delphi for any politically ambitious reason. He only went there to ask about his good friend Socrates. He wanted to know if there was anyone wiser. The oracle replied that no one was wiser. Chaerephon brought this news back to Socrates, and when he told Socrates, it amazed him, and it filled him with perplexity. The Greek word for this experience is aporia. What the heck is the oracle talking about? I'm not wise. I don't know anything about what makes a man happy, or what is justice, or what is virtue. What is the meaning of this riddle? These were Socrates' thoughts. And yet, Socrates also knew that the god does not lie, so he couldn't just brush the comments off either. Notice how Socrates responds so differently from the ambitious and the prideful. Where others are swollen with pretense to knowing, Socrates designs to test the meaning of the oracle. He does not allow his pride to delude him. He harbors no pretense to knowing, but rather sets out to refute the oracle. That is, to find someone out there who is indeed wiser. And he views this process of refuting the oracle in order to see what it might mean as his assigned calling in life. Socrates has been told a perplexing truth, and he seeks to know what it means. He wants to know the meaning of this thing that the oracle has said about him. Aligned with the oracle's command, he desires to know himself. And this becomes the mandate of his entire life journey. It is this activity of questioning, however, that ends up driving people nuts around him. It's what gets him killed. So Socrates went around Athens looking for someone who might be wiser than him. He visited the politicians, the artists, the artisans, and craftsmen. Really, he spoke with anyone willing to chat. Sometimes he'd find that people actually did know things and were wise to that extent. Like the craftsmen, for instance. They knew their stuff when it came to their trade, but then no matter where he went or with whom he spoke, he also found that there was much pretense to know more than what was actually known. The carpenter, for instance, know all sorts of things about building very well, but he'd also suppose that gave him some authority to speak about what is justice or what is piety. So what irritated people was having their pride bubbles burst. Many of them didn't like finding out that what they thought they knew, they didn't really know. And not only that, you've heard how Athens and the Greeks were renowned for their love of disputation and conversation, right? How they loved a good debate, just like they loved a fine wrestling match. Well, folks, and young people in particular, they'd all gather round such conversations with Socrates, and so when Socrates would dialogue with somebody, say a politician, an artist, a craftsman, or maybe just somebody's parent, and when the discussion would eventually reveal that person's pretense to knowing, well, in many ways this was made the revelation of their ignorance. It made the revelation of their ignorance feel like a kind of public shaming to some of Socrates' dialogue partners. And not only that, the young people listening close by in attendance really liked the competitive possibilities of conversational disputation. They saw in Socrates' dialectic a kind of technique that they could use to teach their own fathers to suck eggs. In the Republic, another of Plato's great dialogues, Socrates likens that joy that youth take in learning how to speak in the question and answer format to the delight that puppies take when they get hold of something and tear it to shreds. In other words, there's a kind of playfulness and power that's attractive to youth in Socratic discussions, just as there's great danger for Socrates' puffed-up interlocutors of having their own pride bubbles burst in a very public way. Now, today, I bring up the subject of Socrates' human wisdom for you to consider as students because I want you to think for a moment about this state of affairs in the context of our modern classrooms and the modern university, and especially in terms of your own life. Today, it seems, students come to university and they pass through the education system mostly not to learn how to die. That sounds kind of unpleasant. Or to immortalize, because that sounds spooky. But to earn credentials, to be prepared for their future professions, to be puffed up with technical proficiencies, strategies, toolkits, knowledge and skills, to vie for acclaim, scholarships, and employment. Certainly, most do not come here to learn about and to explore the extent of their own ignorance, or to acquire that, quote, small thing of anthropina sophia. Indeed, if you're an untenured instructor like me, and if students leave your classroom keenly aware of their ignorance, not feeling like they know what they expected they should have learned, they'll let you have it as their teacher, and you'll be out of work in a hurry. Not hemlock anymore, but sustained unemployment and economic death shall suffice. Put another way, most students don't celebrate earning a C, a D, or an F in their courses as an indication that they've made great strides in learning to demonstrate the extent of their ignorance. No. They want high marks. They want high achievement. And they have little patience for unknowing. They hunger rather for certain knowledge, and they pay the big bucks expecting these things and this knowledge to be poured into them. And you'd better deliver it, or else. But this is quite the opposite manner of educating ourselves and of coming to know ourselves than was followed by Socrates, and by all the true lovers of wisdom, ladies and gentlemen. Something is amiss in our hearts when we approach our education in this fashion. And something has grown sickly in our institutions of learning, which should be, after all, sacred spaces for the cultivation of wisdom's pursuit. Our academies and schools are only academies and schools in name, but not in spirit. We are not the children of Socrates or students of Plato's academy. In our self-seeking desires and in our instrumental approach to learning, we are rather the students of the ancient sophists, those hired-gun wise guys who sold their knowledge and skills to clients vying competitively for success and acclaim. Our institutions have mostly lost their genuine academic spirit as sacred spaces where we might practice the art of dying. And our schools have long ago ceased to be places of leisure or scholae, but are rather quite the opposite. They are places of work, or ascholia, such that now we even have silly oxymoronic things like schools of business. In closing, I put the following questions to you. As students and teachers who harbor within you a desire to know yourselves, as people who seek to know the highest things and who would like to pursue an education that speaks to these noble desires, how will you proceed? How will you live your life in order to cultivate Socrates' openness? How will you cultivate the small thing of human wisdom each day at school, as well as when you return home in the evenings? How will you seek to educate yourself? And how will you carry this precious education for wisdom with you, making it central as the mindful core to all your days, and then sharing it with others, because philosophy, while it is the art of dying, is also the quintessential art of caring for souls and for one another. How, in other words, if you're serious about loving wisdom or philosophizing, and not merely a pedant or someone who mouths empty allegiance to philosophy, how will you adopt philosophizing as a genuine way of life? I submit this challenge to you. Thanks for listening.